Hofaone. I am so grateful to join you once again as the 2026 IDWIM co-lead alongside the talented Audrey Lemblisky. Today's mining sector is undergoing a massive transformation, shifting toward automation, sustainability, data-driven decision-making, and intense community scrutiny. In this modern landscape, women aren't just participating. We are uniquely positioned to turn high-level commitments into operational and long-lasting realities. Today's first panel discussion will be about how women are driving execution and accountability in mining today. I am incredibly honored to be joined by three phenomenal global leaders, Carolina from Colombia, Raksha from South Africa, and Dorena from Canada. Each has forged outstanding professional paths in their respective fields. But what truly sets them apart is how they look beyond their day-to-day responsibilities to truly empower other women and drive meaningful change in challenging environments. So I want to start with Carolina, the first question. We know, Carolina, that through the Inter-American Development Bank, Latin American Caribbean Minerals Initiative, the bank is supporting countries across Latin America and the Caribbean to strengthen governance, attract sustainable investment, and promote more inclusive mineral development. Based on the IDB's gender work in the sector, what policy and institutional actions are most critical for governments to expand women's participation in mining, not only jobs, but also technical roles, leadership, supplier ecosystems, and local decision-making? Over to you, Carolina.
Thank you, Maria Jose. It's really an honor to be here today in the International Day of Women in Mining, a day that is very close to my heart because I've worked for this issue throughout my entire career. And that is because I am convinced that mining is not about what we extract, but really how we transform the lives and who we include in the transformation of the lives through mining. And that is precisely what the IDB does. The Inter-American Development Bank is the largest development bank in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in mining, its strategy is precisely to take advantage of the mineral resources of the region and to transform the lives of the citizens of those countries in an inclusive manner. And we have been working in this space for a while, but this year we have revamped our work through a new initiative called IDB Lat Minerals, which works in three pillars. One is to improve policy and regulatory reform. Second, de-risking of mining. And third, infrastructure and value creation through tools such as loans and investment, and financial products. Also through technical assistance and knowledge and partnerships. But specifically with regards to gender in mining, there are four approaches that we have established throughout the years. The first one is that we need better data and diagnostics. We need to better understand what the current state of the participation of women and its different particular issues are in different countries. That is something that the IDB has worked in Peru and Colombia. When I was Deputy Minister of Mines, we established the first baseline of the participation of women in mining, and that was funded by the IDB. So that is the first strategy. The second is to build stronger institutions and public policy. Governments have a very important role in order to advance the agenda to establish inclusion in mining and to really reach all of the communities. And that is something that we have done, for example, in projects in Argentina, where we promoted analysis of how public and institutional processes work. The third is working on value chains. A lot of the value that is around mining is precisely in those suppliers of the value chains. And how do we make sure that there is women in those small and medium enterprises that are providing those bigger mining projects in order to create value? That is something that we worked for example, in Peru. And finally, to remind that mining is not done in cities, it's a territorial approach. It's usually done in rural areas where usually the best jobs in those rural areas are associated to mining projects and their suppliers. And so we need to focus on how to increase the participation of women in those territories, how to increase the probabilities that these women are being hired by these projects. So in summary, our approach in terms of gender is better data, stronger institutions, targeted value chains, and a territorial approach. And again, because it's really not about what we are mining, but how we are transforming the lives of those around mining, especially in an inclusive way. Thank you, Ma.
Thank you, Carolina. It's amazing. And I'm going to stick with the territorial work. That's where you create commitment and you make changes to these different realities. I'm moving a little bit from another country. I'm going with Dorena, who has amazing experience in different operations with IAM Gold. So I'm going to ask Dorena, you know that the Mining Industry Human Resources Council has heavily pushed campaigns lately to attract women to the sector. Yet we have data that shows that while initial recruitment occasionally spikes, retention remains a massive leak in the pipeline, with female representation sharply dropping off due to systematic culture issues, lack of upward mobility, and fly-in, fly-out scheduling. Considering this reality that we have, what are you shifting your HR strategy away from a purely recruitment focus, and how are you doing that approach?
Okay. And good morning. Thank you, Maria Jose. Good afternoon and good evening. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a perspective and point of view. And you're absolutely right, Maria Jose. I think the industry is continuing to advance, attraction, but the data is clear. We're still losing women along the way. So yes, for IAM Gold, the shift has really been about rebalancing towards retention, experience, and inclusion. One intentional change is moving from, representation as the goal, led, inclusively by HR, to, inclusion as the driver of outcome. Because as we've seen, hiring alone doesn't change anything if women don't feel that they belong or see a future with an organization. And, we've had situations when I first began at the company where a site may have achieved its targets, but the other collected data points told a very different story. Lower scores on voice, development, and belonging, or even hiring women in non-leadership roles, cooks and cleaners at site is not quite advancing the real goal of women in the workplace. And that's what pushed us to evolve, our own scorecard to include inclusion and employee experience metrics, not just headcount. So the question we now ask at an enterprise level is, what is the experience once people arrive, and does it enable them to stay and grow? And so there's been a couple shifts. The second shift is that inclusion is no longer a standalone initiative. It's embedded into how we run the business. It sits in leadership expectations, it sits in site practices, and in governance. At the site level, we've had leaders, take ownership of specific inclusion actions coming out of employee listening, for example, addressing how team meetings are run to ensure all voices are heard, and looking at how to shift assignments and how they're allocated. And these are very, very small operational changes, but they have a disproportionate impact on daily experience. And we, as an organization, rely heavily now on employee listening tools to surface those insights, not just assumptions. So data is key, and we heard that earlier as well. And employee listening tools, they can be site-based working groups and committees or other feedback mechanisms such as surveys. And the third shift for us has been being more deliberate about removing structural barriers. We've talked a little bit about this already. In mining, we can't ignore realities like scheduling, site conditions, and progression pathways. We've introduced a bit more flexibility where possible, whether that's looking at roster design or where certain roles can accommodate different working patterns. So we've invested in targeted leadership programs as well, like, taking the stage to build confidence and visibility for women moving into leadership roles. And we're also starting to see progress in representation at leadership levels, which is absolutely critical. And this is a leading indicator that we are improving. So for me, this redirection is quite simple, but it's important. We've moved from how do we attract women into mining to, how do we create an environment where they can stay, grow, and lead? And that's ultimately a culture and leadership question, not just a recruitment one.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dorena. We truly appreciate the efforts that you're doing, and we can see those realities making a real change. Now I'm gonna go with Raksha. I wanna ask you, Raksha, from the South African context, we know that the Mineral Councils refreshed the WIM strategy, deliberately consolidated its focus down to 5 core pillars, heavily emphasizing the transition from fragmented, compliance-driven box checking to a cohesive, operationalized culture shift. As a female CEO that you are, you understand intimately that policy on paper doesn't automatically translate to safety and psychological comfort on the mine phase. How are you leveraging your leadership to ensure that the strategy's primary pillar, creating equitable and dignified workplaces, is practically felt by the woman underground, particularly regarding the zero tolerance enforcements against gender-based violence and harassment, and the rollout of gender-appropriate PPE?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here as well, and happy International Day of Women in Mining. So from a South African context, and I think the work that the Minerals Council of South Africa has done is so important because their 5 pillars represents the complete ecosystem of what it is that we should be looking at, because it's a story and it's a journey in terms of how women in mining not just function, but thrive as well, ultimately. And I think one of the biggest things from a leadership perspective, and as I've seen it through my journey, is to create that safe and dignified workplace. It's got absolutely nothing to do with what's on a piece of paper, on a pretty policy. It is literally how we feel every day when we show up to work. So I draw from my own lived experience and from the challenges that I felt through my early days of my career. And I almost try to make sure that I don't allow someone else to feel the same way. I think we do a lot of work in terms of focusing on how do we create that psychological safety in the workplace? How do we have women that are appreciated and recognized for the fact that they are a woman as opposed to trying to fit into a man's world? And that's where I think the entire issue of the rollout of gender appropriate PPE, whilst it's such a simple basic requirement, it's so necessary because we all have different body shapes. I don't know, you're not trying to squeeze yourself into something that's not meant for your body type, et cetera, et cetera. And I think women feel that they're appreciated and they're seen by doing so. I think a lot of the work that the Minerals Council has done and us as leadership need to continue to do is we need to live the example, and we need to ensure that when we're saying that we are actually creating safe workspaces, we actually are doing it. And I think Dorena mentioned it now, that this goes back to culture. And it's about the type of culture that you create within your organization. And if you're creating a culture where women come in every day, they are seen, they are heard. It's not just a Women's Day celebration, it's an everyday celebration. And on a random Tuesday afternoon, we recognize that you're a female and you've got different challenges or issues or things that you need to focus on. I think as well with the work that I've done at Women in Mining South Africa, over the past few years, we've seen the importance of having a sense of community. And as leaders in this industry, we need to drive that sense of community to also start showing the importance of saying no. Because zero tolerance literally means that it's zero tolerance. And I think the second that we start putting disclaimers to things like that, and as leaders, if we don't actually truly live that, and are not held accountable to it. And I think someone in the chat box had mentioned accountability. I think leaders have got the ultimate accountability. And if we don't live by it every single day, and we don't drive it every single day, then as leaders, we're doing a disservice, not just to women, but to all the male allies that also exist. So for me, I think a lot of it is I live by example. I talk about the good things that we do. I talk about the challenges that we see. And I think from a WIMSA perspective, again, we have so many women who come to talk to us about the problems that they have. And it's about how do we actually take that and tangibly and practically create better spaces for people. Because I think, again, to the question of retention that Dorena spoke about, if we're not creating these safer workspaces, we will lose women if they're feeling uncomfortable. And then we're not going to have a mining industry to fight for anymore. So whilst it's important to bring more and more women into the industry, as leaders, we've got an imperative task of making sure that we retain them by creating psychological spaces that make it okay to be different. Because I mean, being a female is a superpower here, but you're not different in a negative context. You're different from a very positive standpoint as well.
Thank you, Raksha. That is a really important and thoughtful insight of the work that you're doing through WIMSA as well. So we congratulate you on that. Now I'm moving back to Carolina. I want to ask you, we know that the IDB's environmental and social policy framework gives a specific importance to gender equality, inclusive stakeholder engagement, and effective grievance mechanisms. In the mining sector, what lessons has the bank learned about how governments and the public sector can translate these standards into practice to reduce gender-based risks, improve reporting and response mechanisms, and make mining environments safer and more inclusive for women?
Thank you, Maria Jose. And yes, we operate at the IDB under our environmental, social, and policy framework, which basically allows us to translate our commitments into the actual operational practice of the IDB. And this framework not only includes gender equality, but diversity in a broader sense, because we include Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, peoples with disabilities, LGBT populations, and all of this around the idea of stakeholder engagement, and also allowing all of the communities and societies in the region to address the issues at the IDB's grievance mechanisms throughout the project cycle, since their inception, their design, their implementation, and their monitoring and evaluation. And through the implementation of this platform, we have had like three main lessons. Again, about data and standards. So we can't really make standards if we don't understand and make a real diagnosis of what we are talking about. For this reason, our work in creating standards and creating information is so important. And for example, in Chile, we developed a project that produced analytical work on women's participation and also gender-based risks, to the point that both Raksha and Dorena mentioned about what risks women have in their operations, and provided some recommendations in terms of workplace conditions, infrastructure, complaint and grievance systems, and the like. So doing the right diagnosis is very important in order to define these standards and procedures. The second is grievance mechanisms that must be accessible and trusted. And I really liked a word that Raksha mentioned, which is to be accountable. I think in these issues, we all have to be accountable. And the IDB is a multilateral development bank that really promotes the participation of all actors from the civil society through its grievance mechanism. So if there's something that requires better attention or that requires more information, there are mechanisms throughout our policy in order to do that. And finally, again, that the role of the government is very important. I work in the sovereign window of the IDB, and that's why I refer so much to the governments, but also because in my personal experience and in my career, I have worked with governments for many years. And for example, this part of information is also important. And for example, in Colombia, are the diagnosis, the basic data, the baseline that was provided through an IDB-funded project, enabled to refresh and to include the gender perspective into our sector's human rights policy. So there's a very important role for policy in order to advance the issues of gender through the lens of inclusion and including gender into the standards. But all of this, again, is important because, again, it's not about what we are mining, what are the actual minerals that we're taking out of the floor, but really how we are transforming the lives of the people who are around the mining projects. And that includes not only women, but diverse populations, more broadly defined.
Thank you, Carolina. So important to work with the governments in hand as partners, right? Now we're moving with Dorena again. I want to ask you, given your deep experience and evolution as a major Canadian operator, which is IM Gold, what is your primary piece of advice to international peers on the practical steps required to build an inclusive workplace culture across all operational and management tiers?
It's a great question. If I had to distill it into, just one idea, it would be that inclusion has to be treated as almost like a business system, not an HR program. It really needs to be fully embedded into how the organization operates and not adjacent to it. And for us, as an example, that means those inclusion metrics are part of the scorecard. Leadership discussions, including succession planning, are not separate reports that sit on the side of a desk. And so there's that linkage to performance and talent strategy, which is critical. And the second piece is focusing on, and we've shared this already, is, what people actually experience day to day. We've seen cases where policies are in place, maybe there's flexibility, but employees didn't either feel comfortable using the flex, or didn't see them applied consistently. And that gap only becomes visible when you measure experience directly, back to data. And then there is the important part is translating this for us as a global organization, and I sit in the Toronto office, but translating this into local action at the site level, not a generic program from corporate. Our focus is on retention, which ultimately comes down to whether people see a future in the organization, retention and culture and engagement. And one of the most powerful shifts we've seen is when women move into visible operational leadership roles with an emphasis on leadership. It starts to change the perception for everyone coming behind them. And our three minds have made this a priority. And you attach that visibility, combined with either mentorship and sponsorship, and it creates a much more sustainable pipeline. And the fourth point is to address the realities of the operating model. And there's no way about that other than to address it. In our context, that includes rethinking elements of scheduling, because if the model doesn't work for people's lives, retention, engagement, culture will always be a challenge. Even incremental flexibility changes can have a meaningful impact. And finally, and I think the most important point, is that inclusion has to be owned beyond HR. It's where I began. Some of the most effective progress we've seen is when site leaders take ownership, adapting initiatives to their context rather than applying, again, that corporate template. That's when it becomes real and sustainable. So, the advice I'd leave us with is, treat inclusion as how you run the business, not something you layer on top. Culture is defined by what people experience every day. And ultimately, inclusion will show up in the small, everyday moments, who speaks, who is heard, who gets the opportunity. And that's where engagement, retention, culture, a positive culture, is won or lost.
Thank you, Dorena. What an important message. Inclusion as a business strategy. I want to finalize this panel and the last questions, last but not least, with Raksha. I want to ask you, as a female CEO, you are uniquely positioned to actively open doors for the next generation of female leadership. What specific internal sponsorship pipelines do you consider important to ensure female employees are being fast-tracked into the technical automatic roles of the future in South Africa, ensuring your company helps lead this initiative?
I'm going to piggyback off what Dorena just mentioned as well. Like, I'm in full agreement that inclusion is something that's got to be embedded in the business strategy. It's not just a pretty file sitting somewhere. It's got to be something we live and talk about at board level as an incredibly important point of how we have to lead the business. And again, I don't know if it's because I am female that I look at it as a holistic part of how I lead every day, but how I create or open the doors, I just do. I mean, I don't know how else to say that. I mean, I just do it. I know I was very limited in some of the opportunities I had through the early stages of my career, but I am where I am today because of sponsors. And whilst mentorship is absolutely important, and please don't get me wrong, mentorship is imperative, sponsorship is a thing that actually changes what the face of women in mining looks like, because sponsors are the ones who are shouting our names in the rooms that we are not sitting in. So I think building those relationships, showing up, taking initiative to own who you are, firstly, as an individual and what you're about to bring to the table is what's going to get you recognized by those sponsors. Having said that, within organizations, I think we've got to be so intentional about talent acceleration. I think we've got to have clear plans and pathways for women in our organizations. I think we need to be very focused on the fact that the future is going to be automated. It's going to be very technologically driven, very AI driven. And we need to be promoting that sort of technical acceleration in terms of learnings, in terms of adopting the technology into our businesses. And in doing that, you're also starting to create a more safer workplace indirectly as well. I think also it's so necessary to have a very clear plan of what acceleration for each individual looks like. And as leadership, we need to have that. It's almost that middle management layer that we've got to put more focus on as well, because it's all good and well that we've got women coming into our businesses. I'm getting my mentors, I'm getting my development work done. Then I get to like a middle management layer, and then what happens? There's no real development program there for me. So I think as leaders, we've got to be very, very intentional about what is it I'm trying to achieve. I also want a woman who is getting promoted, not just to get to a position and then tick a box to say she's female. When she gets there, she's got to be technically competent. She's got to be able to juggle everything that she needs to. She needs to be abreast of all the technological changes and advancements. So I think it's very much a holistic approach, and how we prioritize sort of like cross-functional rotations, how we actually establish the right type of learnership and leadership programs that women need in order to do more. But I'll say it again. It sounds silly and it sounds simplistic. You just open the doors, guys. If you really want to do it and you really want to make a difference as women, it is our duty and it is our imperative, like an essential duty, to lift each other up. We can't just be saying these things. We've got to actually do it. And so for me, like, I'm incredibly proud. My organization we've got more than 44% female representation. And it's something that I went out and actively focused on. And it's not just people who are there to tick a role. I mean, like, many of my senior managers, they're all technically competent, technically capable, and I'll continue to do so. But in doing that as well, I've ensured that I focus on my male employees to be open-minded and to be embracing women also in the right way, so that as a collective team, we are representing ourselves a lot better as well. But for opening the doors, guys, just open the door and let them come in, and then let's work together from there. So yeah, as simple as it is.
Thank you so much, Raksha. I truly appreciate having a conversation with you, three amazing leaders. Thank you, Dorena, Carolina, and Raksha. We're running out of time, but now, to close the first conversation, we want to turn things over to you, viewers from all over the world. We love to hear your thoughts on two questions related about this first panel about commitment and credibility. So we're going to have two questions. Can we please show the poll? Okay, first question. Everyone must participate. Which ESG metric best reflects community impact? A, community grievances, responses, and resolution time. B, social return outcomes from community projects. Or C, inclusion hiring, local women and underrepresented groups. And the second question is, what best measures sustainable female participation? What are the best measures to sustainable female participation? A is women in leadership and operations. B, female versus male retention rates. Or C, workplace cultures and safety. You have 30 seconds to respond. We would like to hear your thoughts from anywhere in the world that you're looking at us right now. And the speakers can respond as well. There we go. So we'll share the results after we are done. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you so much, Raksha, Dorena, and Carolina again. You certainly deliver a special message to all of us, and we wish you all the best on your journey. So I'm going back to you, Hofaone, to continue with the program. Thank you again.